For more than 70 years, one piece of paper has quietly controlled the world. Not an army, not a president, not a flag, the US dollar. It decides what countries can buy, who can borrow, who can survive a crisis, and who collapses. Oil is priced in it, debt is owed in it, global trade runs through it. If a country wants food during a shortage, it needs dollars. If it wants fuel during a war, it needs dollars. If it wants stability during panic, it runs toward dollars. And yet, right now, something unusual is happening. The world is not abandoning the dollar overnight. There is no stampede, no announcement. But quietly, carefully, the world is preparing for a future where the dollar is no longer trusted the way it once was. This is not hype. This is not conspiracy. This is about numbers, money flows, and decisions being made far away from cameras. And by the end of this story, one thing will be clear. The next 5 years may matter more than the last 50. After World War II, the United States held more than 70% of the world's gold. Europe was physically destroyed. Asia was rebuilding from ruin. Entire economies were operating on ration cards and emergency loans. America, untouched at home, became the financial anchor for everything that followed. That's where the dollar's power truly began. Under the Bretton Woods system, global currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. 1 ounce, $35. No confusion, no speculation. Trust was built into the structure. If you held dollars, you held real value. If you held US debt, you held safety. When the gold link was broken in 1971, many believed the system would fail. It didn't. Instead, it transformed. Oil was priced in dollars. International loans were written in dollars. Global trade contracts defaulted to dollars. If a nation wanted to participate in the modern economy, it needed access to the dollar system, and the system rewarded loyalty. For decades, the dollar strengthened during crises. Wars, recessions, collapses. Money didn't flee the dollar. It rushed toward it. U.S. Treasury bonds became the world's ultimate safe asset. Even today, foreign governments hold trillions of dollars in U.S. debt, not because they love America, but because there has been no better alternative. By the early 2000s, the dollar made up more than 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. That level of dominance had never existed before. No empire in history controlled global finance so completely without formal rule. The dollar didn't need borders. It didn't need soldiers. It moved invisibly through banks, ports, shipping lanes, and balance sheets. But dominance creates comfort, and comfort creates risk. Today, the dollar still sits at the center of the system, but the numbers are shifting. Its share of global reserves has fallen to around 58%. That decline didn't happen in 1 year. It took 2 decades, and that's exactly why it matters. This is not collapse. This is erosion, and erosion only becomes visible after the damage is done. What's more important is where that lost share went. It didn't flow into one rival currency. It scattered. A little into the euro, a little into the yen, some into smaller non-traditional currencies, and increasingly into gold. That tells us something critical. The world isn't choosing a new king, it's choosing options. At the same time, pressure is building inside the United States itself. Federal debt has crossed $36 trillion. Interest payments now exceed $1 trillion every year. That is money spent not on growth, not on production, not on innovation, but on keeping the system alive. For decades, this wasn't a problem. Global demand for U.S. debt absorbed everything, but confidence is not permanent. It is conditional, and global investors are watching political standoffs, debt ceiling threats, emergency spending cycles, and rising deficits with growing caution. Not fear, caution. And caution is enough to change behavior. Quietly, central banks have begun diversifying reserves, not dumping dollars, not declaring rebellion, just reducing exposure, adjusting percentages, preparing for scenarios that used to be unthinkable. Outside the U.S., trade itself is changing. China now trades more with the developing world than with the West. Entire supply chains have shifted. Energy deals, commodity contracts, and regional trade agreements are increasingly settled without touching the dollar at all, not because the dollar failed, but because reliance feels risky. This is the part most people misunderstand. The dollar does not need to collapse to lose power. It only needs to stop being unavoidable. Once countries realize they can trade, borrow, and settle outside the dollar system, even imperfectly, psychological dominance fades, and history shows that once a reserve currency loses exclusivity, it never fully regains it. The British pound didn't die in a crisis. It faded through relevance, and now quietly, carefully, the same question is forming around the US dollar. Not, is it finished? But what happens when it's no longer the only choice? That question is already reshaping the world. When systems feel stable, nobody looks for exits. They don't need to. They stay inside what works. They trust what has always been there. They assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. That's how reserve currencies survive. But when risk enters the picture, not collapse, not panic, just risk, behavior changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. That's where the world is now. China didn't wake up one morning and decide to challenge the dollar. This wasn't ideology, it was math. Over the last 2 decades, China became the largest exporter on Earth. It built supply chains that stretched across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And for most of that time, almost every transaction passed through the US dollar. That dependency came with a cost. Because when trade is settled in a currency you don't control, your economy is exposed to decisions you don't make. Sanctions, payment restrictions, frozen reserves, delayed settlements. The dollar system is efficient, but it is also enforceable. China watched what happened to others. Russia's foreign reserves frozen, Iran cut off from payment systems, Venezuela locked out of global finance. Not through war, through access. That was the turning point. So China began building alternatives, not to replace the dollar, but to survive without it if necessary. Bilateral trade agreements allowed settlement in local currencies. Swap lines between central banks bypassed dollar clearing. China built its own international payment system. Slowly, methodically, trade began to settle in yuan. By now, nearly 30% of China's trade is conducted in its own currency. That's not dominance, but it's independence. And independence is the real threat to any reserve system. At the same time, China began reducing exposure to U.S. treasuries. Not dumping them, that would cause losses, but allowing holdings to shrink over time. Replacing some of that exposure with gold, with strategic commodities, with direct investments tied to real assets. Again, not rebellion, preparation. Then there's BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now expanded to include major energy producers and resource-heavy economies. Together, they represent over 1/3 of global GDP and control enormous shares of oil, gas, metals, and food supply. For decades, these countries traded through the dollar because there was no alternative. Now, they're experimenting with one: a trade settlement framework, a shared unit of account, partial gold backing, direct clearing outside Western financial rails. This is not a new global currency, it's a workaround. And workarounds are dangerous for dominant systems. Because once trade can happen without you, leverage weakens. Energy deals are the clearest signal. Oil contracts settled outside the dollar were once unthinkable. Now they are signed quietly, regional, limited but real, and each one reduces marginal dollar demand. This doesn't crash the system. It drains it. Meanwhile, Europe is watching closely. The euro has always lived in the dollar's shadow. Fragmented debt markets, political divisions, no unified fiscal authority. But crises change behavior. After 2020, the European Union issued joint debt at a scale once considered impossible, hundreds of billions, a test run for something larger. If Europe deepens its bond markets, improves liquidity, and strengthens financial coordination, the euro becomes more than a regional currency. Not a king, but a pillar. And again, that's enough. Central banks don't need perfection. They need options. That's why reserve composition matters so much. The dollar's decline hasn't flowed into one challenger. It's spread across many smaller pieces. That fragmentation is a vote against concentration risk. And when concentration breaks, power redistributes. Now add gold to this picture. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades, not because they expect the dollar to vanish, but because gold carries no political risk, no sanction risk, no counterparty risk. It doesn't depend on promises. Gold doesn't need permission. Silver follows a similar path, but with an edge. It isn't just monetary, it's industrial. Energy systems, electronics, solar infrastructure. When monetary trust weakens and industrial demand rises at the same time, volatility becomes explosive. This is why silver quietly shadows every discussion about monetary transitions. It sits at the intersection of finance and necessity. And then there's the lesson no one wants to talk about. Venezuela. Venezuela didn't collapse because it ran out of oil. It collapsed because it ran out of dollars. When access to the dollar system was cut, imports slowed. Inflation didn't rise, it detonated. Prices doubled, then tripled, then lost meaning entirely. At one point, inflation surpassed 500% annually. Wages became irrelevant. Savings vanished. Money stopped working. This is what happens when currency confidence breaks faster than alternatives can form. No one is claiming this is America's future, but systems don't need to repeat history exactly to rhyme with it. The dollar protects the U.S. from consequences, until it doesn't. And that's the uncomfortable reality now facing the world. Not that the dollar is finished, but that the exits are being tested, quietly, carefully, relentlessly. The greatest mistake people make when they think about financial collapse is imagining noise, sirens, panic, markets on fire. But history shows something colder. The most dangerous moment is not the fall, it's the transition. That's the phase where nothing looks broken. But nothing works the way it used to. The dollar's power has never come from perfection. It has come from trust during chaos. When wars break out, when markets freeze, when currencies wobble, money doesn't scatter randomly, it concentrates. And for decades, it concentrated in one place, the US dollar. That is what made it the world's reserve currency. Not strength in good times, reliability in bad ones. But that dynamic only holds as long as the world believes the dollar will be protected at any cost. And that belief is now being quietly tested. Look at the numbers again. U.S. federal debt is over $36 trillion. Annual interest costs have crossed $1 trillion. That interest bill grows automatically as rates rise, regardless of economic growth, productivity, or political promises. This is not a future risk. It is a mechanical one. Every year, more debt must be issued just to service existing debt. For global investors, this creates a question that didn't exist before. Not will the U.S. pay, but at what cost to the system? Because there are only three ways out of a debt trap this large: growth, inflation, or devaluation. Growth at that scale would require productivity gains not seen in generations. Inflation quietly taxes holders of debt. Devaluation shifts the burden outward. Reserve currency status allows all three, temporarily. But temporarily is the key word. Now imagine a world where confidence weakens just enough to change behavior, but not enough to trigger panic. Foreign buyers demand higher yields to hold U.S. debt. Treasury auctions still clear, but at rising cost. The Federal Reserve steps in more frequently to stabilize markets. Liquidity becomes conditional. Predictability fades. Nothing breaks. But nothing feels solid. This is where volatility lives. At the same time, global trade continues fragmenting. Regional blocs settle trade locally. Energy contracts diversify currencies. Commodity producers negotiate alternatives. Each transaction removes a small piece of global dollar demand. Individually, meaningless. Collectively, structural. Now layer in technology. Digital payment systems move faster than regulation. Central bank digital currencies are tested quietly. Cross-border settlement becomes cheaper outside legacy rails. The dollar system doesn't disappear. It becomes optional. Optional systems don't command obedience. They compete. And competition is something the reserve system has never faced before. This is the moment when markets behave strangely. Gold doesn't spike because collapse is imminent. It rises because uncertainty has no price ceiling. Silver becomes volatile because it straddles two worlds, money and industry. As energy transitions accelerate, demand rises. As trust weakens, speculation follows. Small imbalances create outsized moves. Currencies fluctuate not based on fundamentals alone, but on positioning. Who is exposed? Who is hedged? Who is trapped? This is where the lessons of Venezuela matter most. Venezuela didn't fall apart the day sanctions hit. It fell apart in the months after, when confidence vanished faster than alternatives could form. People didn't know what to price goods in. Contracts failed. Barter returned. Informal systems replaced formal ones. That confusion, not poverty, caused the real damage. Now apply that lesson globally. If the dollar system ever loses trust faster than replacements mature, the result is not immediate collapse. It is friction, delays, mismatches. Liquidity where it's not needed and shortages where it is. Shipping slows, credit tightens. Prices behave irrationally, not because supply disappears, but because settlement fails. This is what transition looks like. And it's why the idea of a dollar crash is misleading. The real risk is something far quieter. A world where the dollar still exists, but no longer anchors behavior. In that world, the U.S. loses its ability to export inflation without consequence. Borrowing costs rise structurally. Fiscal choices become constrained. Political trade-offs become unavoidable. For the rest of the world, the adjustment is uneven. Countries with commodities and gold benefit. Countries dependent on imports suffer. Middle classes feel it first, through prices, credit access, and currency volatility. No announcement is made. No ceremony marks the shift. It just happens. One auction clears weekly. One reserve manager reallocates 5%. And then another. And then another. By the time headlines catch up, the system has already changed. This is why timing matters more than prediction. You don't prepare for transitions when they are obvious. No, you prepare when they are denied. Most people never notice the system they live inside. That's how systems succeed. Money works, cards swipe, shelves stay full, paychecks arrive. When those things happen, nobody asks questions. Reserve currencies are supposed to feel boring, invisible, permanent. The US dollar earned that role by surviving every crisis thrown at it for generations. Wars, recessions, financial crashes. Each time, it came out stronger. Each time, the world ran toward it, not away from it. That history matters. And it's why this moment is different. Because what's changing now is not the dollar itself, but the environment around it. For the first time since World War II, the United States is not the uncontested center of global production, energy, and trade. Supply chains are regionalizing. Energy routes are shifting. Political alignment is fragmenting. And in that world, dependence becomes vulnerability. Reserve currency status amplifies strength. It also magnifies weakness. When the dollar was unquestioned, the U.S. could run deficits without consequence, borrow cheaply, sanction freely, stabilize markets instantly. Those tools still exist, but they are no longer costless. Every sanction accelerates alternatives. Every crisis encourages hedging. Every political standoff chips away at confidence. This doesn't end the system, it reveals its price. Over the next 5 years, the most likely outcome is not collapse, but constraint. The dollar remains dominant, but less forgiving. Markets demand higher yields. Borrowing costs rise structurally. Fiscal choices become harder. Trade-offs become real. For the rest of the world, adaptation accelerates. Countries rich in commodities, energy, and metals gain leverage. Those dependent on imports feel pressure. Middle classes everywhere absorb the shock first, through prices, credit, and purchasing power. Gold remains a neutral anchor. Silver remains volatile, pulled between money and industry. Currencies fluctuate more violently as capital searches for safety that no longer has a single address. This is not a dramatic ending. It's a narrowing one. Fewer free options, less margin for error, more consequences for mistakes. And that is what the end of dominance really looks like. Not chaos, responsibility. History doesn't remove systems overnight. It outgrows them. The British pound didn't vanish. It became local. The same future may await the dollar. Not worthless, not rejected, but no longer able to shape the world alone. When that happens, power redistributes. Quietly, unevenly, permanently. The mistake is waiting for confirmation. By the time certainty arrives, preparation is no longer possible. This isn't a call to panic. It's a call to awareness. Because the people who understand transitions don't react. They adjust. And in a world where money stops being invisible, understanding becomes the most valuable asset of all.